everybody. Special today. I'm just going to ask my guests to mute themselves just for a minute because it always echoes for some reason. Make sure everyone's muted. I think everyone's muted. Fantastic. So hello, everybody, and welcome to our special Aucademy session on autistic empathy. And importantly, we're going to be discussing the double empathy problem. So if you haven't heard of this problem before, this theory, we'll be covering it. If you have, we're going to be adding our discussion in terms of where do we think it could go, where is it going, and how is it actually helping autistic people, because it's helping people to understand us, for instance. So I am Dr. Chloe Farahar. I am a white person with a shaved head, giant glasses, and my favourite jumper that people probably see me wearing all the time. I do change my jumpers. I just like this one a lot. And it says current mood potato with like a sideways laying potato. And I'm sitting in my office. So before we jump into discussing, obviously, the double empathy problem and how autistic people do have empathy, as usual, we usually start by asking each guest, who are you? And what are your dedicated interests? So I'm going to ask each of my guests today if they wouldn't mind doing a brief physical description and just letting us know who they are and what are their dedicated interests. So I'm going to go in order of how I can see people on my screen. So Rachel, if you don't mind. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, that helps. Hi guys, I'm Rachel. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a white person with short blue hair and a black and white sort of doodle hoodie. I've got like a Batman thing in the background, some sensory lights on. My special interests academically are autistic research and specifically sort of communication and linguistics, and other interests include Batman. So that's me.
Fantastic. And then Bobbi? And on mute, don't forget everyone's on mute.
I always forget that part. Hi, I'm Bobbi. I'm white. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white female with dark glasses and gray, purple, and pink hair. I'm dressed in black as usual. I don't kind of wear any other color. I'm sitting in a very small home office with a shelf of books behind me. My special interests are autism. And more specifically, how people in school and those who work in schools and work alongside autistic children, and how I can help them understand the autistic experience better. I'm also an autistic parent of two. And other than that, my interests are I make candles. I'm kind of into horror. That's about it.
Fantastic. And Kieran?
I'm muted. Hi, I'm Kieran. I'm a 42-year-old autistic white man, slightly balding, quite balding, fairly chubby, and I'm sitting in my office space with my panda over my shoulder, and I'm a researcher, writer, consultant, trainer, do kind of lots of different things, but mostly focused around autistic masking, stigma, and identity, and I'm the parent of 3 children.
Lovely, fantastic. And Annette?
Hello, my name is Annette. My pronouns are she, they. I am a white 50-year-old woman with long blonde hair and blue eyes, and I'm wearing black, sitting in a white room. And I'm an autistic academic and multidisciplinary artist. My special interest is probably art and autistic research, especially into autistic culture.
Lovely. Fantastic. Okay, so, and we don't have time, everybody, we usually would like to ask everybody when did they discover they were autistic, but we've actually had each of these lovely guests on before, so you're welcome to find any of the talks that we've done with them before to actually find out their backgrounds about when did they discover they were autistic. But because we've got quite a bit to get through, because it's such a important and meaty topic, and there's a number of us to talk about this in detail. So what I'd like to do is to start by quoting and paraphrasing a recent paper that was discussing autistic people, the double empathy problem and the implications for development and mental health. And that was by Mitchell, Shepherd and Cassidy, published this year in 2021. So to start the quote, behaviour of autistic people is misperceived by the neurotypical majority in society. This misperception could have far-reaching negative consequences for the development of autistic individuals. This misperception could result in autistic people being excluded from the social world to a degree which is detrimental to both autistic and non-autistic groups, as both are denied opportunities to benefit from each other's skills and abilities. Moreover, social exclusion could impact negatively on mental health, leading to individuals to mask and pretend to be other than they are, leading to low self-esteem and a sense of thwarted belonging. In some cases, this could lead to suicidal thoughts, end quote. So there are many reasons why, as autistic people, we have poor life outcomes. But what this quote and all of us here, I think, would argue is that non-autistic people, so neurotypical people, do not understand us, and so we are treated poorly in society. That many neurotypical people lack empathy of and with us as the autistic people, and yet the myth persists that autistic people lack empathy. So what I want us to do is pick some of those things apart, and I'm going to start with the basics. So the very, very basic thing is, what is empathy? And so importantly as well, we're going to hopefully pick this apart, because I think generally speaking, lay people and society have quite a narrow understanding of what empathy is. So I'd quite like to pick that apart. So anyone want to jump in first? What is empathy? Go on then, Kieran.
I'll jump in. Everyone else is too scared. Basically, it's the ability to see things from somebody else's perspective in a very, 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 very small nutshell, because actually we don't really know what empathy is, because we think there's multiple component parts to it. But we've been told all this time that autistic people can't see things from other people's perspectives, that we are unable to stand in someone else's shoes, to use the kind of analogy that is often used. And it's just not true. And it's not true in degrees. For some people, it is very true, and for other people, it is not true at all. So, you know, it's one of those things where there's a huge amount of generalization and oversimplification of what's actually a really, really difficult thing to tease apart and to pick apart.
And do we have any other, how else might we discuss and describe empathy? So yes, it's a very complex thing, much more complex than like we say, that maybe the lay person understands. Any other thoughts on what empathy is? Yes, Bobbi.
Well, from my point of view, I identify, or I know I am, hyper empathetic. So the effective part of what they call empathy, so there's 3 parts to it: affective, cognitive, and I believe compassionate. And affective means kind of your emotions only. And that's where I'm very much affected. I feel intense emotions very quickly, and I can pick them up from other people. So it's a slap in my face in a way, the idea and theory that, you know, we don't have empathy, when I literally am overflowing with it sometimes, because my emotions are so on the edge, and I can feel what another person's feeling. If I'm talking to somebody and they start crying, guarantee you I start crying. I'll mirror it, and I'll also sort of hold it in for a while, and it takes a bit of time to let loose. And my youngest goes through the same thing, and it's something that I don't even think those neurotypical people are even considering. I don't even think they actually even realize that.
And Rachel? I saw Rachel's hand.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't necessarily cry if someone else was crying, but I think where my empathy sort of steps in is that I jump straight to action. I'm looking for things like, you know, kind of got like a mental board in my head going, right, so here's the problem, here are the possible outcomes, here are solutions, here are possible options to try, you know, like a little flow diagram, like we can try this, if that doesn't work, we try this, and things like that. I think because I'm so fixed on trying to be like, oh, this is, you know, something bad's going on, let's try and help. So that's the kind of the last step of empathy. I think it was called compassionate empathy, where you kind of move to action, which again I think a lot of autistic people do have. I think, you know, that's partly why I think a lot of autistic people tend to be like innovators or creators and things like that, because it's that they feel a need because they saw one and they just did it. So yeah, yeah.
And Annette?
Yeah, I mean, I consider myself hyper empathetic as well. That was one of the reasons why I think one of the reasons why psychologists didn't diagnose me right away, because they said, well, oh, you have empathy. You can't be autistic. And I think that there was a whole group of people that just weren't diagnosed because of that stereotype. And basically, it comes down to more about cognitive empathy. I mean, it's the next question, basically, about where did the myth come from? But it came from a study that basically, it was a Sally Ann study, wasn't it?
Okay, so let's, okay. Yes, we'll move on to that then. Okay,
I won't bring that.
Sure.
But not only, yeah, I guess for me, it's interesting because I was at a talk where I was describing my experience as a child. And one of the things that I remember is that I would walk into the room and I felt like an emotional antenna. I felt like I could feel other people's emotions in the room. And I was very aware of what was going on with everyone. And it was really interesting because there was a parent of an autistic person who was was nonverbal. And they looked at me and they said, "Oh my God, you are explaining something that I know that my child, that happens to them." But I didn't know how to explain it. And I thought that was really interesting, that, you know, it's just so the autistic community is so misunderstood when it comes to empathy.
And what you've just highlighted there is definitely something we can talk about towards the later part of the discussion, which is how useful we can be as autistic people who are capable and, you know, privileged that we do have speech, that we could potentially be translators. So that's something I think we can come back to. That would be quite interesting. So yes, to sort of summarize everything that was just said then, I think it is important to recognise, yeah, empathy is quite complex. There is discussion and has been discussion on it being different things. It can mean different things. So we've got this idea of cognitive perspective taking as empathy. We've got emotional, or what Bobbi mentioned is known as affective empathy, so feeling or understanding another person's feelings, and compassionate empathy, so that need, that drive to actually help somebody else or support somebody else, or whatever it might be in terms of emotional understanding. So given that we've got those three sort of definitions of forms of empathy, and just to be clear, everybody, Damian is here. So we've got a video submitted by Damian to support with the discussion. And Damian's also in the comment section, but Damian is attending to childcare of his children today. So he is here, but not on the screen with us. So I've just flagged that Damian had a comment down here for us, which was that empathy, i.e. cognitive, so meaning perspective taking of another human being, could be seen as a convenient illusion. And I'd be quite interested, Damian, if you want to elaborate, if you have the chance to, on that. So I do want to jump into then, now we've got this rough idea of three potential forms of empathy, so cognitive perspective taking, emotional empathy, and compassionate empathy. Where does the myth that autistic people lack empathy come from? So Annette started with this. I don't know if you wanted to talk to that, or if anyone else wanted to jump in about where does the myth come from?
Well, from my memory, because I'm an academic, but I don't have a very good memory. It comes from several experiments that people did in the 90s based on autistic children, looking at the Sally Ann kind of experiment. It was basically, there was a thing in a box, was there not? And there it was like, okay, there was a person that, oh, go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, so
Rachel probably had to look at this.
Oh, in depth. There were actually quite a few tests. So there was actually 6 non-verbal tests used and 6 sort of linguistic tests. And what I mean by that is they were asked questions about certain scenarios instead of just being watched on behavior. The Sally Ann test, there were 2 dolls in a box and both had a basket. And in one of the baskets, there was a coin. And outside of that, you have, in the experiment, you have an experimenter and a child. And what happens is that the coin is in one box, so say it's in Sally's box, and Anne doesn't have a coin. The experimenter then takes Sally out of the experiment. And I may be mixing up the names, but it's person A and B generally, but Sally and Anne. So Sally then goes outside, and while Sally's outside, the coin gets moved from Anne's basket to Sally's basket. And the child is then asked the question, when Sally gets put back in the room, where would Sally look for the coin? This is supposed to demonstrate theory of mind based on who has what knowledge of what scenario. When you're looking at it from an autistic perspective, that question doesn't ask that. And also, when you actually run the scenario in real life, it actually falls apart as an actual experiment because it's asking who can see what, but then making the assumption that the doll also has a theory of mind, but it's a doll. It's an object, not a human being. So that gets a little bit more complicated. Another test that was used was a spoon test. So person A had a spoon, person B was thinking of a spoon, who could touch a spoon? This is actually something my work kind of touches upon and used as an experiment as my master's. But basically the idea is that it's supposed to show the difference, the ontological distinction, which is the ability to tell what's real and what's imaginary. And they argued that autistic people, autistic children specifically, because they didn't answer person A a lot of the time, that indicated that they couldn't tell the difference between what was real and what was imaginary. And that went towards theory of mind and the understanding that, in order to understand the difference between person A having a spoon and person B thinking about a spoon, you have to understand their thinking and how they're sort of perceiving the world. Although as my research kind of demonstrates, it doesn't test that at all and actually doesn't stand up as a test. So there's a lot of holes in the theory of mind and empathy problem that Baron Cohen kind of came to. But that's sort of the main, that's one of two kind of issues with it. But yeah, it's highly flawed.
And I think Kieran would like to contribute to the discussion as well. And I just want to, I don't know if it's going to touch on this, but I just wanted to flag this. So Katie's saying theory of mind and cognitive empathy are sometimes mixed up. So I don't know if you're going to touch on that, Kieran, but obviously feel free, jump in.
I can. I was more going to touch on the proponent of the theory, who is one of our special friends, who we talk about all the time. His ears must burn constantly, which is Sir Professor Baron Cohen, who we've had lots of discussions about over the last few months.
To be clear, for people who aren't aware, we are being sarcastic because actually autistic people can be sarcastic, which is what Kieran's doing right now.
Yeah, this is sarcasm. I need a /s on the end of my sentences, don't I? So Simon Baron Cohen is the... Well, he gets a bit of a bad rap with this because people think it's all him, and it isn't. It's Uta Thrift as well. Uta Thrift is underpinning all of Simon Baron Cohen's work, and actually, when you start going back through Asperger's work, he was touching on elements of this as well. So this is kind of 60, 70, 80 years of nonsense all being wrapped up, but was really, really focused hard on in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s, mid to late 90s and early 2000s, because we've got Uta Thrift and her lovely triangles as well, where we all have to, you're not autistic unless you can, sorry, you're autistic if you can't give an emotional validation to a moving triangle. Yes, that is an actual test that they did with autistic people. They had moving triangles and you had to give an emotional state to a moving triangle. And if you gave the wrong emotional state to the moving triangle, then that means that you're autistic. It's just utterly meaningless. So yeah, so you've got this mix of these two very, very big names in the world of autism, especially back in the kind of Simon Baron Cohen at the beginnings of his career. But Uta Thrift really is a big name there in the kind of the mid-90s and through to the 2000s. Who are coming up with this stuff, and this is the stuff we're still unpicking today, the stuff that we're still dealing with today, not just because Baron Cohen has based his whole career on this thing, but also because, as we know, something from academia goes out into the world, and then you can't claw it back, and it stays there, and whatever people hear first, that's what sticks with them, that's their confirmation bias. So we're still unpicking this in education, health, and all these places because of these ridiculous theories back in the 90s, which, as Rachel clearly said, were absolutely flawed. And I've forgotten what Katie's point was. What was Katie's point about?
Oh, just that sometimes there's a little bit of a mix-up, I guess, or their where is it? Hold on, I don't know. Yes, Rachel.
I was just going to add, certainly coming from my research perspective, is the link between pragmatics and empathy and theory of mind is actually really interesting, because you touched on the shapes and Schimmel's test, that the shapes moving around inanimate. That was actually in the Mind Blindness book written by Baron Cohen. And it's actually really interesting because from a linguistic perspective, when you break it down under the hypothesis, when he's asking, describe what's happening in the picture, autistic people do it perfectly. Triangle goes in and out of a thing, other follow, triangle follows it. They didn't ask, could you project emotional, cognitive dissonance onto a shape? They're asking what's happening. They told you point blank what was happening. Again, in the spoon scenario, who can touch spoon? Well, you didn't say theoretically, someone had to physically touch spoon theoretically, or in real life. You just said who could touch spoon. And a lot of the linguistic sort of tests that are used in mind blindness actually break down at a pragmatic level, because actually when you look at autistic responses versus non-autistic responses and what the question actually asks, there's a lot of inference that just isn't there. Well, it is, but not for us. So what you're saying about the shapes and Schimmel test and like sort of how flawed they are is actually, when you look at the kind of the way they did these tests, you can prove that actually the only thing they're testing is pragmatic ability, not theory of mind. And the link between theory of mind and pragmatics is deeply misunderstood. Yeah. And that's part of what builds it. So you were saying about Uta Frith. Yeah, because she adds to that. She adds to the linguistic pragmatic aspect of it and saying, you have to have certain pragmatic abilities. And it's like, actually, what if it's different? Because like I said, if you've got a different set of empathy, as we, the double empathy problem is kind of touching upon, well, actually defines it, is that, if the pragmatic system's different and the empathy system's different, and if empathy and pragmatics are linked, then we're looking at two entirely different systems, not a deficit. And I think that's where the flawed aspect comes in, is that they didn't really know what they were doing.
And I noticed your hand, Bobby, but I think Annette also wanted to contribute something. And then I can come to Bobby.
Well, I also wanted to say, because empathy is so complicated as well, I think not only were the theories the experiments flawed and kind of disproved, basically, but once again, and Kieran kind of touched on this, that the media just jumped on the word empathy, and then it became this thing where autistic people didn't have empathy and we were robots. We had no emotions, we had no hand movements, we had no facial expression. And you see that in things like The Good Doctor, where the actor actually is trying to, you can see him pretending to be a robot. And that was done, not very many years ago. I just watched it for the first time, and went, oh my God, I can't believe this. He's actually pretending to be a robot. And I think that's made it worse. So, that's what happens, basically. News picks up on something and then it becomes a part of culture. And we have all these stereotypes about autistic people that are just a part of the culture now, about what people think about autistic people.
And I think that's also what's frustrating, is that even if which we sound like we do, dislike and have major issues with that research in the first place, but that's not even what they were saying in that research. They were saying that we lack or struggle or have a deficit, in quotation marks, with that cognitive perspective taking side of empathy, not the emotional side. But like we say, the problem is that layperson doesn't know that empathy can mean multiple things, and they just take it to mean emotion, and that we must be emotionless. I just want to add this point from Damian, because I don't want to keep him to the side because he's not on the screen, but this was interesting as well. So full cognitive empathy would mean telepathy. So as far as I know, that kind of superpower is a fiction. Indeed, in Plato's dialogues, it was considered godlike. So this idea that we're supposed to be able to just know exactly what the other person in front of us is thinking would be telepathy. So yes, thank you, Damian. And Bobby.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that flawed theory that happened back in the 90s is still being implemented in every school across this country. Every time we turn to an autistic child and talk about social stories and social skills and all of that, it's in play. It's automatic, because otherwise they wouldn't be considering it. So it's embedded in the education system. And, and it's kind of why I do what I do, because I'm desperate to sort of change that narrative for the kids coming up. you know, because they are automatically being othered, and automatically it's assumed that they, you know, they are little robots and they don't have the empathy, and we need to teach it to them.
And this is good. So now Bobbi's actually led us into our next question, or my next question, which is, why is this myth
Chloe,
a problem?
could I just jump in there a second?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes, Kieran.
I just wanted to add there to Damian's point, and it's actually reflective of Bobbi's as well, in terms of non-autistic professionals know that, you know, to have full cognitive empathy, it would be telepathy. You know, they know that it's not a realistic thing, but it's still centered around the fact that that is actually a thing, that non-autistic people do exist like that they do have full cognitive empathy for everybody and can happily say what somebody else is thinking and feeling and see things perfectly from their perspective, even though they know that's not the case. So that lens is then applied to us as saying, well, you have full 100% deficits in the ability to do this, when in actual fact, we can do this perfectly well. And that's not the case at all. This is something that everybody struggles with. Every human being struggles with this to certain degrees, depending on a huge amount of different things. But like Bobbi was saying, when it comes to education, when you've got teachers in this position who are applying this myth to children under their care, and coming from the point of view that they know that they don't know exactly what everybody else is thinking and feeling, but still that standard is still applied to the autistic children under their care, that's so damaging and so harmful. And
this is what Damian said earlier on, which is performing empathy in socially expected ways to non-autistic people. Yes, Rachel.
I was just going to add in on that, that almost if you look at it from, and I think the only way to look at it, because I'm autistic, is from an autistic perspective, is that actually the whole idea of autistic people lacking empathy is actually a reflection of neurotypical or non-autistic lack of empathy. So, you know, the whole thing about autistic people lacking empathy was because it was built around the fact that you can't read us. So I'm sorry, just so you can't do something and that's somehow our fault. Just so we're clear. You know, do you mean it's like kind of actually a reflective, it's almost like projection in the purest form.
So let's carry on with this then. So why it's a problem and how it impacts our community. So obviously it's a massive myth that it isn't even based on what was initially discussed in the literature, which is that we lack emotion. Basically, we don't feel things, we have no emotional empathy. So that's obviously a myth. Bobbi's spoken about that it's an issue because, for instance, young children in schools are being treated as if they have no emotional empathy, as if you need to teach them that, and then it's basically forcing some neuronormative standards of what it means to empathize. And any other thoughts on why this myth is a problem and how it impacts us? Rachel?
Just coming at it from a mental health perspective, because we know it's ridiculously common in the autistic community. Things about empathy in mental health services. So, for example, if an autistic person presents a mental health service for anything, being automatically told, well, that's not really how you feel, is it? That's not, you know, if an autistic person goes to therapy and goes, I've got no friends, I'm depressed. Well, that's not true. There must be someone. And the constant invalidation that comes from the, and that's even assuming that the mental health practitioner takes it for granted that autistic person feels emotion, because there'd be some people would be like, well, you're autistic, how can you have mental health problems? Which is kind of almost the study that Cullen did in 2018, where he looked into the suicide, trigger warning, the unaliving rates of autistic people, even though it literally not 20 years ago, he said, well, you don't feel emotion, so, you know, how could this be a thing? And then 20 years later is looking into you know, harming rates of autistic people, of themselves and things like that. And you're like, oh, so you'll budge on the fact that autistic people can now feel emotions, but you'll still hold it true that autistic people still can't understand the emotions of others. And it's like, make it make sense. So massively harming.
That's actually a very interesting point as well. Very important point is, yes, if we lack emotional anything, if we lack feeling, then how can we possibly have mental health concerns? And how can we, and we all know that we don't get the support that we need when it comes to mental health. They don't know what to do with us because they'll say it's an autism thing when actually it's a mental health need that we might have. Any other thoughts on how it impacts us as autistic people and a community? So mental health, schools, stereotypes, stigma, we're basically treated, as Annette said, and thought of as robots. Did you
but it also,
want to add?
yeah, it also makes us autistic people, to a certain extent, feel as if they can't have a community, they can't have friends, they can't, you know, and we all become these islands, you know, that we don't actually connect with each other, and we don't build communities, and we don't, because we don't feel that we can, or that we're allowed to, because supposedly we have no empathy. I mean, to a certain extent, when you're thinking of theory of mind as well, that we're not actually even human. So that, you know, people not seeing autistic people as human is so incredibly detrimental to the community. And you know, that stigma is written all over our bodies. We carry it around with us every day. And a lot of people, especially, you know, autistic people tend to feel as if it's my fault, and I am all these things, and, you know, all the words that everybody calls me, those things, that's actually who I am. And that is incredibly detrimental to self-esteem, to, you know, having any self-worth whatsoever. And, you know, that it's very apparent, the lack of community. Obviously that's trying to change, and that's one big thing that we're trying to do, is to build communities, and to teach other autistic people to build communities.
Thank you, Annette. And Kieran?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of add to that, I mean, we have the name for what Annette's described there, which is internalized ableism, which is what we are handed. That's the narrative that we're handed, and that's not even just a narrative that we're handed when we know that we're autistic. It's a narrative that we're handed when nobody knows, including ourselves, that we're autistic. When we're very small children, we're invalidated over every aspect of our being, and, you know, from our sensory to the way that we speak or don't speak, the way that we eat our food, the food that we eat, the way that we sleep or don't sleep, everything about us is pathologized even before we're given that label, or we find that label for ourselves and identify with it. And then, but that narrative of not being human, that predates the whole empathy thing. I mean, that goes back to the 50s and 60s, and even goes back to Asperger, and then goes back to Big and Canner, and the things that they were talking about, where, you know, even Asperger separated us out into useful or not useful. You know, and Canner focused very much on people who he saw as not quite human. And then we have the narrative in the 60s coming from Ivor Lovaas and people like that, who actually blatantly came out and said that we weren't fully human and we needed to be molded into human beings. So that narrative has been there for a very long time and built upon. And even if you took an autistic person in isolation who had no cultural impact, if they were brought up in a vacuum, the moment they entered society, that would hit them like a shockwave. That narrative there, it's still there. It still exists all around us. If I walked out into the street and grabbed someone off the street right now and said, tell me what you think about autism, 99 times out of 100, they would tell me the most derogatory explanation of what autistic people are. And that's because that cultural narrative is now out there. And people like Thrift and Baron Cohen, with these narratives around lacking empathy and the cultural understanding of how that's around emotion, which Baron Cohen has never really walked back on publicly, and never taken ownership for as well. This narrative that's out there, that has such a huge impact on us, not only in education, not only in terms of mental health, but in employment, in welfare, in care, in health. Every aspect of our lives surrounding us thinks this way about us. And that's written into the systems that are around us, the systems of support or not support, or, you know, and everything is focused on this very narrow view of what it means to be human. And we don't match that narrow view of what it means to be human. The diagnostic criteria is a narrow view. It is this gold standard human being, and we're held up against that, and we're found failing against it because we can't match it. But no human probably matches that gold standard human being, you know, but nobody else gets held up to it in that way, apart from us and apart from people who are ADHD with their own criteria and so on with different other labels and conditions and things. And it's just, we exist in a permanent world of gaslighting. And that's the problem. And the support that is there for us is written in a way that gaslights us. The education that's there for us is written in a way that gaslights us. And it just, nothing about anything in life validates autistic experience at all.
And Rachel, I think, wanted to contribute, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because I know we're on a time. I was just going to say what sort of couple of points that Kieran touched up upon. That, you know, we're looking at a kind of a community or a group of people that from the outset have been divided even against themselves. You know, like with functioning labels and eugenics and the rest of it. Because again, people that can do well, like Mark Zuckerberg, and that can run international companies, oh yeah, keep them, they're fine. But you know, the second you struggle with anything or you become too much of a problem or you aren't absolutely productive, you know, coming back to the Spectrum 10K study that I know is triggering for a lot of autistic people, it's an ongoing narrative that, you know, whilst we are trying to change that, the dominant narrative is still we can segregate you, we can make you fight amongst yourselves, we can then gaslight you and tell you that you have no understanding of emotions, but then punish you for challenging behavior, which is just severe distress, which we're in kind of constantly. You know, you've got a bunch of contradictions that don't hold up. You either feel no emotion or you have too much emotion and you're expressing that too much in meltdowns or shutdowns or anything else. You know, you're either not intelligent and you get, you know, put in a home if you've got intellectual disabilities, things like that, or, you know, you've kind of almost on the short end of the stick for support, or if you are able to go to mainstream education or have some level of education that isn't considered learning disability, you're considered able and you can do just fine on your own, so why would you need support? And it's this constant level of contradiction where autistic people are constantly battered, no matter where you are on the spectrum, between you're either too competent and you're going to struggle, and if you don't do well, we're just going to punish the hell out of you, or you're not competent enough and nothing you'll ever do matters, and, you know, it's wide and dry. And it's like, where are we going to find an equal footing where we're just people and we're just trying to like survive? And I think that's the key point, is we're not even trying to live, we're just trying to survive as a cultural group, as people.
Yeah. For people who aren't aware, we're death clapping. Okay, because we've got some other questions to get through, and that was like question 2. So what about alexithymia? So alexithymia, for those who aren't too sure, might mean that actually majority of us in some capacity as autistic people struggle to either feel or recognize that we're feeling or articulate an emotion or feelings, which is not the same as not experiencing them or having them. So it's just that disconnect and that difficulty to recognize my heart is racing right now. That might be an indicator of upset, for instance, or I've got what's classed as butterflies in my stomach, in quotation marks, and that might be anxiety or happiness and so on. So sometimes it's that difficulty of explaining it to other people. So given that alexithymia is much greater for the autistic community, generally speaking, why is it important that we discuss this? For a reason, actually. Why is alexithymia not the same as lacking empathy? So just want to touch on this so that we can get it done and dealt with and move on from the fact that we do obviously have empathy. So anyone want to explain or touch on why is alexithymia not the same as lacking empathy? Yes, Bobbi.
Well, I've experienced this with my youngest. Identifying emotions or having a name for those emotions was really challenging. So we had to learn what my child's youngest words were, like their own words, and what they meant. So we knew that if they said that their stomach was sour, that they were actually, that was a physical thing. Their stomach was feeling a little bit upset. Or if they're, you know, oh, my chest just feels really heavy, but my heart's beating really fast. Okay, well, we're realizing that's anxiety. So, you know, it exists. And this is also a kid who's very hyper empathetic as well. So it complicates things when you're feeling the emotion, but you don't always know. So, you know, a friend would be upset, and my youngest didn't always know what to do with that, like how, because they got stuck right at the identifying part, so they couldn't go further. Then they wanted to help, but it was a minefield of how to do that if you can't identify the emotion at you know, that you're feeling at its hand. So it complicates things a lot more. And it makes, oh God, my child was seen as obstinate, defiant, and all of these other reasons as a result of that, because when you can't identify it, sometimes you just shut down. You don't try to explain it, you just keep it on yourself. So that's kind of my experience of those two interacting.
Okay, hold on. I think that went Rachel, Annette, Kieran. I just want to flag that so I flagged those in that order, I think is right. I just want to also flag that we had quite early on, which Kieran grabbed for me because we knew we were going to have this question, and somebody actually brought something up that feels like it contributes. So Wendy says, I'm curious, is it common for autistic children to be highly empathetic? So we're discussing potentially yes. It obviously depends on the individual, but potentially yes. And then through trauma, for instance, from school, can empathy become, can empathy more switched off because it's too much to feel so much empathy? So Kieran flagged that for me. And I think, yes, I think that's what we're talking about now as well, that alexithymia potentially also could be a trauma response. I don't know if anyone knows more about that. So I'm kind of connecting the dots more than saying that is definite. So I think it went Rachel, Annette, Kieran. So Rachel.
I think for me, the main difference with alexithymia is that just because you can't describe it doesn't mean you're not feeling it. And I think for autistic people, feelings are quite abstract because I think people are taught emotions based on the physical. So we're happy, well, you're smiling. How does that feel inside? Do you feel calm? Because calm and happy are two different feelings, but they can look similar. I'm smiling. Well, I could be calm or I could be happy. Those are like, happy is kind of, for me, more of an excitement feeling. Calm is more of a relaxed contentment feeling. But like Bobbi touched on, how does that feel on my body? Like, for example, I have quite a lot of anxiety, but I've only just realized that I've gone most of my life with having anxiety because no one ever sat down and said anxiety is a racing heart, butterflies in your stomach, because again, butterflies in your stomach means you're excited. Well, not always. And actually identifying the physical sensations to a word or to an emotion rather than kind of just abstractly going around like, I feel happy. Okay, well, like, what the hell does that actually mean? Can an autistic person have a grimace on their face and be happy? Absolutely. So a smile doesn't always equate to happiness, or, what would be considered the stereotypical non-verbal signs for certain emotions aren't always the case for the actual emotion. It depends on the person, how they feel and what they identify that as. People can pretty much tell what sensations are negative and what are positive. It's just whether they can explain that with words is the disconnect. But then that doesn't mean that there's a lack of feeling there, which again was kind of empathy is about. So yeah.
And I just want to contribute with Damian's comment, which is when emotions are not mirrored. So I think this is what you've also just sort of talked about as well, Rachel. So when emotions are not mirrored by non-autistic people around you and mislabeled, this will contribute to alexithymia. So like you just said, so somebody might be, when you walk in and you're basically being lied to, you walk in and you clearly can tell that something's wrong and the person is smiling, but you know that doesn't feel right. There's a disconnect. So I can imagine that would really contribute to us being confused by our understanding other people's emotions and our own. And Damian says, I was rather good at creating neologisms to describe my emotions as a child. I don't know how to pronounce that word, so I might have pronounced it completely wrong. And Annette.
Oh, I'm just going to say, obviously, when just the question for autistic people, we talk about this all the time within communities, just the question, how are you feeling today? How do you feel today? Autistic people hate that question because it is much more complicated than that. And really, most neurotypical people just want fine. But we don't want to say that because that's not how we feel. And obviously, if you have trouble identifying your emotions, you don't know. And why do you don't want to be asked a question every single time you meet somebody that you can't answer? And Chloe says that she always says small, which, I'm quite used to now.
I feel small.
Yeah, you feel small. That's how you feel.
I feel small. And that's genuinely a feeling. Louis gets confused because, my partner, he gets confused with that because he doesn't understand that as a neurotypically expected expression of emotion. But to me, I do feel small. When I'm asked, how are you doing? It's such a big question. And then it just makes me think of so many things that it makes me feel really tiny. And that's genuinely how I feel. So
Yeah.
And I like this as well that Tanya's got here, which is how do we even know we have the same emotional experiences as neurotypical people? Because who just feels one emotion?
Exactly.
Who just feels straightforward happiness or,
Yeah.
you know, this kind of thing. And what Annette was just saying, I think it's perfectly valid for any human being, but particularly autistic people, adults and children, to say, and it be valid, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because they genuinely don't know, but they are always badgered about, well, you must know. What does it, do you feel this? Do you feel that? And it's like, they just told you how they feel, and now you're invalidating that response, which is, I don't know, which is a perfectly valid thing to say.
And I think,
yes, right. Oh, sorry, go on.
But there's major problems with therapy for autistic people because of that. The questions, how do you feel, is like a huge question that therapists ask constantly. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about? And if you are alexithymic, that is just not going to work for you. And you know, I'm finding it difficult to find a counselor that's actually going to be able to work with an autistic person and make it work for us. I think all sorts of things like that. You know, to deal with mental health and autistic people is much more complicated because of this, and neurotypical people's, you know, like you said, frustration if we don't give an answer to how do you feel about that.
Rachel, because I know Kieran was waiting, so is that all right to come back to you, or is it going to mess up what you were going to say? I can't tell if Rachel's frozen.
Oh, sorry, was that to me?
Yeah, I was just saying, I know Kieran wanted to go.
He just picks up really quickly on the I don't know side of things. Just because I'd say I've got a non-autistic partner, and when I've asked this, sort of like, well, you know, you don't know, okay, you don't know. Actually, in most cases, I think it comes back to projection, is that they actually do know, they just don't have the words to either explain it or they don't want to explain it. So when an autistic person says I don't know because they genuinely don't know, they're pushed because neurotypicals generally, when they say they don't know, it's like they're not willing to say, or they haven't themselves figured out. Like there's a lot going on, so they're trying to identify them each individually, which is quite difficult. But so when an autistic person doesn't know, they kind of keep pressing because they're like, well, you do, but you're just not telling me, kind of thing. So that's what I just wanted to add quickly. Sorry, thank you, Kieran.
And Kieran.
I had something to say, and now I have 4,000 things to say because everyone's made really good points. And some of you actually said things, some of the things that I was going to say anyway, especially Damian with the thing that came up earlier, and Tanya with the who feels one emotion thing as well, because nobody feels one emotion. Everybody feels different things about. I remember being asked this question. I remember vividly being asked this question. I must have been 10 or 11, and somebody asked me how I feel, and I was at school and I was feeling horrible because I was at school, but I couldn't tell them that. I was feeling happy because I knew that school was nearly ending because it was near the end of the day and I was going to go home. And I know that my mum had bought me a book that day and I was looking forward to going home and reading that book. And I was feeling it was near the end of the week and I was dreading my grandparents coming at the weekend because I never really got on with my grandma. So, you know, I had these multitude of and I was probably hungry and tired and all these different things going on. But to take it back to alexithymia, like right back to the beginning, like what is alexithymia? You said the thing about trauma, Chloe, and is it connected to trauma? And yes, it is. Tanya actually put in a thing about eating disorders and things, and it's been linked in eating disorder research to trauma, and it's something that I know through work with Amy and stuff that we've done together that there's actually a fair amount of alexithymia research out there that does link it to trauma. But I think it's strongly related to developmental gaslighting. That as you grow up as an autistic person, you are asked how you feel and you don't know how you feel, and that's not a good enough response for the people that are asking you. So you make it up or you say I don't know, and then you're pressured into giving some kind of answer, and eventually it gets to the point where you don't know how you feel because you don't know what the right answer is to say at any given moment. You stop listening to your gut, or you're unable to listen to your gut anymore. You're unable to process your internal kind of physical state. And I think that's why there's such a strong link with people who are strongly alexithymic to people who have got interoceptive issues, because I think, again, it's that gaslighting that makes you not listen to your own body and you can't recognize your own sense of state anymore. So you reach the point where you don't know what's going on at any given moment. You haven't got a clue what's going on inside your head, inside your body, emotionally, physically, because people just keep telling you that you can't possibly be feeling nothing, or you can't possibly be feeling this or that, because that's not the appropriate neurotypical emotion to be feeling in that given moment. And it's just such a confusing thing developmentally. And I really think, I mean, for me personally, I think that's why I'm as alexithymic as I am. I mean, I can be slamming doors and shouting and stamping and not even realizing that I'm doing it. And 3 days later, I'll be like, oh yeah, I was feeling quite angry then. You know, and people will point it out to me, and I'll be furiously denying that I'm feeling those. I'm not angry. I'm not angry, and that makes me angrier, obviously. You know, it's those things, and then you can see how that impacts on relationships as well. And it all comes back to this thing that we are experiencing things that non-autistic people don't experience, or they do experience, but not to the extremes that we experience, and are therefore gaslighting us over that because they're the majority and we're the minority.
And you've kind of touched on my thing that I think is just like my mantra. So your mantra is always talking, or not necessarily mantra, but always, we know we're going to get on to talking about masking at some point if we talk long enough with Kieran.
Very well.
And my thing is talking about whether you're thinking pictures or not, and the link to whether you have interoception difficulties or differences and are more likely to be alexithymic. So we do end up with seeing this sort of pattern. And certainly, yeah, I think it is quite interesting. And there needs obviously to be more work done on connecting invalidation trauma to how alexithymic a person is, and how difficult they find recognizing, you know, feelings in their own body, and so on. I just want to flag something kind of light-hearted, because we're going to move on to what even is the double empathy problem, because we haven't got there yet. And I need to find it because it amused me, and I thought it'd be quite nice to have here, which was this person says, I emulated cat emotions. If you're angry and you know it, hiss and claw. And I quite liked that. And I think sometimes this becomes quite an interesting thing as well, that Annette, and actually I think Rachel, you would have been there as well. We did the sort of, it was a council-led initiative to try and give some forms of support and education to families waiting for young people to be diagnosed as autistic. And we were working with some young people that day. And it was interesting. There was this lovely young lad who was about 7. And his mum, while we were like, you know, doing the activities, his mum was like, he does this thing. He gets very upset when we go into a shop and he picks up a toy and decides, actually, no, I'm not going to buy it with my pocket money because I don't have a lot, and I'm going to decide not to, and puts it back, and then gets really upset that he's left it behind. But, you know, he doesn't have those sorts of feelings and emotions for me. And I find this really interesting because I think there was at least 2 of us as autistic people going, that's not weird. A lot of us as autistic people do this. We find it easier, I guess, to ascribe emotions to inanimate objects. This is my opinion anyway. Obviously, there might be different things, but it's easier to ascribe things to things that don't confuse us. So this is George the giraffe, who was made for me. It's easier to ascribe emotions because they're not going to mess about with you. Right. They're nice and straightforward, and they don't confuse us. They don't smile when actually they're probably sad, and they're, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think it is quite common for us to find it easier potentially when they're an inanimate object or an animal. Any thoughts on that? Actually, that's not one of my questions for the structured session, but
there is a little bit of research just that autistic people tend from. I mean, it was a qualitative study and interviewed people about anthropomorphizing objects, and autistic people tended to anthropomorphize objects more. And I think it comes down to, if you're invalidated constantly whenever you speak to a non-autistic person, it's much easier to kind of create a world of your own, isn't it? To have these objects that, you know, are your friends, and especially as children. But I think the research also said that autistic people tend to continue to do it throughout their lives, not just as children, where neurotypical people are more likely to do it as children and then kind of
yeah. I'm 37. I still do it. I just showed you George. I would be very upset if somebody threw George across the room. Right, that would upset me because I'd feel sorry for him, and he's a he. You know, there's those kinds of things. So, and Damian says here, oh yeah, and Rachel's showing us. So everyone's showing us now. It's fantastic. Everyone on the screen, if you're not sure. So Rachel's showing some. I don't know what, Rachel, you were showing us. It was something really strange and cute.
It's an ugly doll from the movie on Netflix, and a narwhal.
Okay, ugly doll and a narwhal. Bobby's got one of the emotion octopodes that I think are fantastic for actually helping us. Kieran will have to explain the panda in a minute, and Annette has got a squashmallow owl. But Kieran, what is with the panda?
I have a few friends where if they make too many demands of me, they just get panda gifts in response constantly. And I didn't realize that the panda was kind of the symbol for PDA. And I don't think I'm PDA, but for the last few years, I've been incredibly demand avoidant. I don't know if that's just getting older and angrier. But I've become
the word
incredibly
crotchety.
so,
I like the word crotchety comes to mind.
Yeah, that is a
when
good
we get
word.
older.
So the panda is basically when I'm overwhelmed, people just get panda gifts, and then they just keep asking me questions, and they just get more panda gifts, and that's the response they get.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think also,
oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love Damian's, objects tend to tell the truth about how they are. It's really great as well. And I think also it's sensorial. We love our senses. We love, one of the reasons why I like this is how soft it is. So it's connected to all sorts of things for autistic people. It's not just one thing is why we like objects.
That's what I said
has their naked cat.
I said that in the chat, didn't I? That the same with animals, because their emotions are their emotions. Their emotional states are obvious. They're not hiding anything. They're not pretending to be one thing and doing another. And I think that's just easier to read. It's less complicated.
Yeah, a cat wagging its tail is quite a nice, clear indicator. A cat purring is quite a nice, I say cat because I don't have a dog, are quite nice indicators of what they are thinking and feeling, I think. Yeah, and also Rachel made a comment which was lack of rejection from objects as well. We are less likely to, hopefully George isn't going to reject me, George the giraffe, but we're less likely to be rejected as well. Okay, so we do need to move on. I need to unpin that comment now so we can get back down. There we go. Right, so now we're on to, it didn't take too long, just an hour. So what is the double empathy problem and how does it combat the myth that we lack empathy? So for this section, we've got a short video from Damian. So I'm going to play that now, and then we're going to carry on with the discussion as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Damian Milton. I'm a senior lecturer at the Tizard Centre, University of Kent, and I'm autistic myself, and I'm a researcher in the field of autism, as it's called. I also have an autistic son who would be classed as having severe learning disabilities as well. My main interests are in participatory autism research, so autistic people take more of a lead in what research is done about us. Description of my appearance: I'm largely bald, some hair at the sides, middle-aged man, a white man with glasses and a largely grey beard with auburn tones in the moustache area. What exactly is the double empathy problem? Well, there's a lot of theory behind it, but in its very basic sense, it's how any two people can misunderstand each other in social interaction, and that this misunderstanding can be due to differing life experiences and perception of the world. So for autistic people whose perceptions of the world around them, sensory inputs, information processing, etc., is going to lead to a different experience of life and a mismatch of understanding in social interactions. And this is not to say that all autistic people will interact well with all other autistic people, as much as not all non-autistic people will interact well with one another. However, there is increased opportunities potentially for connection to be made, as it were. So in a sense, it's a case of mutual incomprehension between very differing experiences of life, which obviously goes against the notion that autistic people are lacking empathy, and more specifically cognitive empathy or theory of mind. It's to say that both autistic and non-autistic people can struggle in terms of cognitive empathy, especially with one another. And where is research in this area going? Well, when I first coined the term and theorised about the double empathy problem, it was mainly based on my own personal experiences and anecdotal or qualitative accounts of other autistic people going back to the early 1990s, like Jim Sinclair, and accounts such as that. And these kind of issues have been commented on by autistic people for a very long time, misunderstanding of others towards their way of being. In more recent years, we've had a lot more psychology type research into the double empathy problem, communication differences through Catherine Crompton's work and Elizabeth Shepherd and Danny Roper at Nottingham. We've also had Gemma Williams' excellent work in linguistics, looking at various aspects of the double empathy problem and how it plays out in actual social interaction. And I think this will continue. Groups like Noah Satson's in America as well. However, I think there's going to be a growing trend in a more sociological aspect of the double empathy problem, situating it within power relations, as well as the practical implications of the double empathy problem. We're already seeing that in the paper being discussed this evening around mental health, but also in relationships with doctors and healthcare generally, in education, the way exams and assignments are set for students, to the understanding within school or higher education establishments. So I think it's only going to expand because it's been influencing research in disciplines across the academic spectrum, if you like. How will it continue to help? Well, I think the double empathy problem, alongside some other theories that are perhaps more recently being applied to autistic ways of being, have the potential to destabilize how autism has historically been viewed, which is predominantly as some kind of disorder of social interaction within the mind of the autistic person. And put more centrally, the cognitive and perceptual differences that are developmental as well. But those kinds of different ways of thinking as more central and sensory processing is becoming more central to how we think about autistic perception. And the social dynamics are somewhat cascading from those cognitive differences, but also the social situatedness and sociological aspects that autistic lives are led. So I think there's area is only going to mushroom, as it were, across disciplines and areas and applications, which is really nice to see. So, thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Damian, if you're still here in our comment section. So I think, can we just summarise how we might have interpreted the double empathy problem? So obviously we've heard from Damian there, who developed this theory. For me, I always talk about it as an interactional issue, that there's a breakdown in the middle between autistic and non-autistic people, to try and really boil down the concept to something really quite straightforward. That there's a translation issue between two cultural perspectives, two cultural languages. And I think all of us here actually talk now very much about autistic people as we are a cultural group, we are a cultural minority, and that might be one of the best ways to actually combat the double empathy problem, i.e. getting non-autistic people to view us as coming from a different cultural perspective to their own, and that they need to start to understand that we using still the same language, i.e. English, as Rachel tells us, but we are it is not necessarily as if it were our native tongue per se. Damian just as usual likes to talk about four candles. Four candles. It's an old skit. It's the Two Ronnies. Is it the Two Ronnies? Not specifically. Yeah, okay. And I think it was really interesting and important to hear from Damian talking about how it might move forward into a more sociological perspective as well. So, or coming from a more sociological perspective in terms of what are the power dynamics that means that our cultural minority is being discriminated against. And actually, I would like to cover this. I did a talk recently for the Stigma Autism Research Network, where I was talking about we should stop talking about stigma towards autism and be talking about prejudice towards autistic people. So moving away wholly from this idea of autism as a disorder, which is where stigma usually is, used as a framework, and thinking more in terms of prejudice towards a group of people who are connected. So lots of interesting things. Any thoughts based on Damian's video, or wanting to summarize what we understand of the double empathy problem? Yes, Kieran?
I think it's obviously immensely important. It actually, without Damian's work, I wouldn't have any work, because it underpins everything I do. I do public training 3 or 4 times a year, which has like 300 to 400 professionals on it over a course of weeks, and everything is underpinned by the double empathy problem, because it is a reframing of autism from an autistic perspective, and that's what I'm giving to people who come on my training. And it's also the sociological aspect as well has informed my research and the academic work that I do. The paper that I had out with Amy at the beginning of the year around masking, it was looking at masking from a sociological perspective, because it hadn't really been, it had been through Goffman and Du Bois and all these wonderful different academics over the course of years, but from an autistic perspective, apart from Damian, it hadn't really been looked at within that kind of sociological framework. The assumption that we grow up and exist in this vacuum, that we aren't a part of society, when we're very much a part of society and are also impacted by society, is the bit that's missed. So, like you said, Chloe, to explain it, I also use the cultural, the cultural narratives, the comparing, that we are a growing and blossoming culture, and we have all the markings of a culture, and then we have a cultural clash with other cultures. We're using the same language, but we're interpreting the words very, very differently and applying different meaning to those words sometimes. And I think one of the biggest problems that we have as autistic people is that the language isn't good enough. We don't have our own language, and it's something that we need. We need our own words to describe things, which we're starting to do. but then that's when we get to that point where we do have our own language and we do have our own terms for things and we can explain them. They are independent things and not tainted by neurotypical thinking, and they haven't come from neurotypical perspectives, and we've just kind of adapted them for our own use. We need our own words and our own terminology in order to be able to explain our own lives.
And I just flagged, I think this contributes as well. So this person, Pam, is saying, often like holding an indigenous relational worldview and communicating using the same letters, words, sentences, but zero understanding with someone holding the linear colonial worldview. And I think, Rachel, that's somewhat what you've just definitely discussed with your hypothesis. So Rachel next, and then Bobbi.
I'm going to hog the screen for like 5 minutes, sorry, just because I have to go soon. But there's a lot that I wanted to sort of cover. So in terms of Damian's framework, just a little quick answer. I actually started my master's in linguistics at the University of Brighton, 2018. I actually had to drop out. I basically finished the degree. Apart from doing my dissertation, I had to drop out of the university because I couldn't do what I've just completed at the University of Kent, because I was told in no uncertain terms, this idea just doesn't work. Just doesn't work. My research shows that it does. And I actually chose to go to the University of Kent because of Damian and because of Damian's theories and outlook on autistic relations. Because I knew that whilst the idea was, out there, I'd have the best chance at proving it or trying to prove it if I was under someone who understood what I was up against. Now, my university lecturer at Brighton just wasn't autistic, and quite frankly, there was a couple of issues throughout the year. But basically, it was just the kind of understanding. Pragmatics just doesn't work that way. And what I've come to realize is, yeah, for you. And actually, what kind of my work does, and what I'm kind of basically expanding upon in a PhD in September next year, is the kind of idea that autistic people have their own functional pragmatic system, not a deficit in communication. So coming back to what I was saying sort of at the start of this about the way that the tests were used to prove mind blindness, things like that, they're actually testing pragmatic systems. My research actually found on a almost triple the sample size than both Baron Cohen and the original test that was used by Wellman and Aids. They only used a sample of something like 13 children. I think Baron Cohen used something like 20, if that. I used 174 participants, and the test doesn't hold up. The linguistic test used when you know what you're doing, when you look at the pragmatic system, which is kind of where my hypothesis is actually hypothesizing how autistic people communicate rather than just going, okay, well, we know there's a difference here. It's been framed as a deficit, but it's now a difference. And Damian's framework gave that rise. It gave it a possibility. When I first started researching autism, it was horrific, and my mental health tanked. I was doing an English degree. This was just more of a research thing on the side, and I tanked mentally because I couldn't deal with the fact that I was this thing that was being described. And then I kind of crossed the identity problem, and I went, oh my god, this. And a lot, like Kieran was saying, a lot of my work and I think a lot of autistic people's work is built upon the foundation that we're coming at it from a difference, not a deficit, and that it's relational, not a problem. And people aren't problems. It's the relational aspect of communication. I think one of my biggest viewpoints on autistic communication is generally that it seems to be the only difference in people being independent, having the right care. So, for example, in the case of people that are either non-verbal and use communication aids, or sign language, or anything that isn't sort of colloquially sort of verbal language in the way that we are currently using it, their support needs are really highly not being met because people just don't understand what they need. And then they've got tools like a little iPad or something that has very basic, for adults we're talking as well, very basic, very simplistic things that will not, you try and use these things to describe your day and you'd be falling short by miles. How the hell is anyone supposed to say, I would like to go for a walk, or I would like to even do anything when their schedule's preset? They've got little things that are just moved around that don't really mean anything. But whereas people that can use language like us, that we can use verbal language, we are much more able to advocate for our needs. And even then that's a problem, because again, the way we're using the language to communicate our needs, neurotypical people fall short again. But not because we're falling short as people, not because our communication system is falling short, but because there is this absolute disconnect, which is basically what the double empathy problem frames perfectly. And I think for me personally, overall, it validates the experience of going, hang on a minute, I'm not overreacting. I'm not, you know, and because I think a lot of autistic people fall into the thing about gaslighting themselves. Like, maybe I was wrong, because that's what they've kind of been told all of their lives. And where I kind of get excited about the work that I do is that actually, I think above all else, the self-advocacy and the advocacy would improve tenfold if people actually could say, hang on, what I'm asking for isn't unreasonable. And just because I'm not understanding what you're saying doesn't mean I'm in the wrong here. Maybe you need to explain clearer. So for example, one of my prime examples I was going to say, and forgot to say like several times this evening, is if autistic people are supposed to have these communication difficulties, how are we communicating in a civilized, turn-taking manner that, again, exchanging information? This is functional and more functional than anything ever described in kind of classic research that hasn't kind of come out in the last sort of 5-10 years or so. And again, there are people perpetuating the idea that, again, it's a communication difference, or sorry, communication deficit and not a communication difference. But the research that I do and the research sort of that Crompton's coming up with and people are coming out with is actually it's different. And just because you don't understand, kind of coming on the Alexithymia point, just because you don't understand how to explain it or describe it doesn't mean that's not going on. And kind of what I aim to do is kind of almost give a voice, give a label to actually what's going on. So like you said on my previous video, it's not an add-on, it's actually describing what's going on. To an extent, yes, it is. Theoretically, hypothetically still, we still need to do more research, but I say my MA research has just kind of proven that it works, and you can, if you understand how the autistic pragmatic system works, which I'm starting to, again, still really, really early in its kind of development, you can actually use this in terms of practical application. So for example, I'd say I have a non-autistic partner, so relationship wise, oh Christ, the amount of fights it saves. Education wise, my mum's a school teacher. I was saying to Bobbi earlier, things like exam questions that will get right but fail because they're not asking what they're asking. Again, with the theory of mind questions, they're being asked questions that they answer directly, but then again, that's the wrong answer. It's like actually, and it's like actually, the idea that there can be more than one answer to a question that seemingly only has one answer. That doesn't mean an indication of a deficit. That doesn't mean an indication of, it just means we're dealing with a different brain pattern. For example, dyslexics, the way they process language is different, but in the way that we currently understand and use language, it looks like it's a deficit, but it's not. It may just be a difference. And also dyslexics have a different way of thinking. So actually using language as a marker for different ways of thinking, because it reflects, language is kind of a reflection of thought. It's that kind of connection between the internal and external world, and the way that we relate to others, non-verbal communication, verbal communication. It's kind of, as Damian was saying earlier, if we didn't have that, it would be basically telepathy, which it's not a real thing so far as outside of Marvel and DC kind of universes go. But the thing about it is that, for so long, even when we're kind of being absolutely clear and we're kind of doing everything right, we'll still get kind of told we're doing it wrong. But actually understanding why, and in terms of the double empathy problem is great in terms of giving us a starting point of going, actually it's a difference, not a deficit, but actually explaining how that works in practice, I think, is the key here. For example, like with sensor issues, we know autistic people have sensor issues. Have we got much research going into how to make that better? Or are we just getting more and more research coming out about, autistic people have sensor issues? Great, we know. How do we make that better for us, though? For example, the Spectrum 10 case study. We want to increase autistic people's well-being. We're telling you what we need, and you're going, yeah, it's probably genetics, isn't it? Because gay people suffer, in the world because of their genetics. The gay gene or whatever, also just a context, I am gay. And a lot of people on the autistic spectrum are also on the LGBT spectrum. And I think it's in terms of where the double empathy problem's going, and going back to the stigma side of it, how do we know autistic people are perpetuating stigma? The fact that we even have to use empirical research to prove the fact that we're human ends it. Because that just stands to a point, is that I shouldn't have to use empirical research to prove my humanity. I shouldn't have to do this kind of research. I shouldn't have to have my mental health tanked because I'm told I'm ineffectively inhuman. When I have so much love in the world, and I think a lot of people, and this is coming back to the inanimate objects thing, we have so much love in the world and so much emotion that we just want to share our rich internal world with the world. And every kind of opportunity we have to share that with other people, unless also kind of going into autistic spaces, you're shut out at every turn. And also, like Kieran was saying, the effect that has in terms of masking and things like that, it's detrimental. And kind of the whole argument that would you ever find an autistic person that hasn't got trauma? Currently, no. And the language aspect of my research kind of almost validates why that's the case. So, for example, coming back to the question, how was your day? Oh, don't even ask. Don't even ask. Which I think why I said to you, Chloe, how are you doing? As making that, thinking that would make a difference, but obviously not. So I won't ask that again in future. But that kind of, even down to a workplace, for example, I got into trouble because I said I needed to clock out 10 minutes early based on the way my shift pattern was and getting home and getting enough sleep before my next shift. 10 minutes was just enough for me to wind down. I was actually sitting in my car for 10 minutes, then clocking out at 10 o'clock because I thought that's what they meant. They thought I was going home and thought I was actually trying to scam money out the company by going back in and clocking out at 10 o'clock. And I was like, I thought that was because it wasn't made clear that 10 minutes, what to do with those 10 minutes. They thought I was going home. I was clocking out at 10 o'clock because my official finish time was 10 o'clock, but I took a 20-minute break and took the other 10 minutes at the end of my shift and then clocked out at 10, whereas they thought I was going home 10 minutes early. And I actually got in trouble for this. And it was just literally a simple linguistic misunderstanding. And because it wasn't clear. And I think a lot of this happens in a lot of my relationships as well, with especially non-autistic people, is when they think they're being clear, no. And then you get almost vilified for saying, I'd like to ask follow-up questions because, and again, why are you asking stupid questions? Why are you being stupid? And that kind of constant gaslighting and constant invalidation. What I love about this hypothesis is that so many people have come to me and said, this actually works for me. And I've gone, great, because I wasn't sure I was right. And I don't have to be right. But if it works for you, use it. I'm not saying it's going to work for everyone. I'm not saying it's universal. I don't know, maybe it might be. But if it works for you, use it, because honestly, I think it would make such a difference. It certainly has in my life. I mean, God, even just being able to know that I could drop out of a master's and not feel like a complete failure and redo another master's and actually do it right again the second time, because I had faith in what I was doing and not just being invalidated because linguistics doesn't work that way. Well, I know it does. And I have to say, Damian as kind of almost like a revered man in this household because of what he has done, and the platform that he has, that he shares with other autistic people to allow it to kind of grow to the way it has, to allow people like me and Chloe to come and even have these platforms. Without that, we would still be back almost in the dark ages of just being, oh, we're just deficits and we're just broken people. And I think, again, the fact that we shouldn't even have to be using empirical research to prove our humanity and our differences are not deficits. We're in that situation, so we're going to keep going with it until enough things are changing where people can no longer say, oh, well, you're just autistic, so you don't understand. No, I do actually understand, probably better than you think, and actually having the tools to explain that and expand upon that in a way that isn't detrimental to their mental health, because there's been no framework up until now for actually there is a difference, but I don't know how to tell you that. There is something, like we've all had it in our lives where it's like, actually doesn't feel quite right. I don't have the way to explain that. I don't have the tools to explain to you why I know I'm not wrong. But then that's all you hear. Like Kieran was saying, it's very easy to just think your entire life you're just in the wrong. And I think personally the hypothesis that I'm working on is so important, because I think it gives validation to people and tools to say, actually there's another way, and I'm going to show you that way for me, how it works for me. And for me, it's more just about giving people the tools to actually succeed in life and not be harassed in the workplace or bullied in the playground because oh, don't be stupid, don't ask silly questions. They're not silly questions, and actually there's so much more going on that if we understood, I think the potential of autistic people could skyrocket more than we've ever seen before. So yeah, that's me.
And I know, because you're about to leave us, because thank you so much for that, Rachel, and everyone's jumping on that in the comment section as well. And that was such a powerful point as well, that at this point in time, it's terrible that we're having to have empirical research to demonstrate our humanity. I think that's quite a key thing that you've brought up. And I think what I want to say before you leave as well, because we're going to still got a couple of questions left if the others are still okay to carry on for a bit. But what I wanted to also talk about today, which is why I'm glad we got to have you on as well again. So for those of you who haven't seen Rachel already talk with us about their hypothesis, it is really important to go and watch that, because what I find really interesting is that we had Damian come up with this theory that made sense. It's logical, it's clear, it's so simple as well as a theory. It's beautifully simple, but actually very humanizing of us. Then what we started to see is a small number of studies. Rachel's mentioned a couple, Damian mentioned them as well. There's not loads at this point in time, but research like Crompton demonstrating that this is happening, that the double empathy problem is a thing. It is happening, that when you bring a non-autistic and an autistic person together in a study, the communication breaks down somewhat. So we're seeing it being substantiated. The important thing now is people like yourself, Rachel, because then you are the ones substantiating the why. So we've got the theory, we've got the evidence it's happening, but then we've got the well, why is it happening? So obviously we don't have the time and you need to disappear soon. But obviously your hypothesis is arguing that fundamentally, yes, we are processing language pragmatically, but differently to non-autistic people. So very, very important. And so I like all this. This is all about where we're going to go when you disappear in a moment, which is talking about, well, where is this double empathy problem taking us? Where is this theory taking us? And I feel like you're taking it to do the applied and practical side of things.
Just wanted to add one last thing on that, is that I think the thing that's been missing from autistic research for so long, or autism research as it were, is for years they've almost been on repeat. You got problems, okay, cool, and what? And I think, again, if you're autistic and you need something done, do it yourself, because no one's going to come and do it for you. And I think this is kind of where a lot of autistic people come from. Certainly myself, is that, you know, great, we know we're done, we're sick to death of knowing what the issues are, but where is the, you know, for example, we know people who use wheelchairs, we know their legs don't work either consistently or at all, but where's the accommodation there? Where's the wheelchair as such? And you know, I think this is kind of why I'm so kind of excited about this, is that this could actually give people an accessible tool to actually advocate for themselves in every area of their life, no matter what they choose to do, and actually almost give people better self-advocacy and autonomy over themselves, over their choices, over what they do, because they have the tools to almost not fight back, as it were, but actually stand their ground and not have nothing to fall back on. So moving forward, I think the biggest thing that Damian has ever kind of done is that he's given us a way to, or a framework to do. Sorry, those are my rabbits, they're having a party. But the biggest thing that they can do, that we can do with this, is actually put the thing in place that was never done, which is, okay, well, we know what it is now. How do we move forward? How do we actually help people? But I've got to go because I've got to go to work. But thank you so much for having me on. I say I always love these things. So thank you so much. And it's been a privilege to be part of this. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Rachel.
Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
And Damian, also just wanting to detail, I guess, I can't think of the word that I want, but wanting to explain that much of what Damian was able to do was made possible by those who came before Damian, so especially Dinah Murray, but Wen Lawson, Jim Sinclair and others. And this is, oh, look at all this beautiful empathy that happens from autistic people. Like, Damian didn't want to just take on, yeah, it was all me. No, Damian wanting to demonstrate some empathy here and being like, no, there were other fantastic autistic people who've also contributed to these theories and these ideas. So thanks for that as well, Damian. Any other thoughts before I move on to any other questions? Yeah.
Just with the kind of, obviously, to highlight the importance of the pragmatic kind of side of this, that, you know, that this does need to be a applicable thing. Something Chloe and I were talking at the Nurture conference the other day, and I don't know what else to call it. It was the Nurture conference. And one of the slides that I used in my talk was actually a tweet from Spectrum, who are an autism research magazine journal thing. And it's from a couple of years ago, and I use it quite a lot in training and stuff to highlight the importance of the double empathy problem. I just want to read it out. And it says, autistic people are 4 times as likely to experience depression over the course of their lives as their neurotypical peers. Yet researchers know little about why or how best to help. I mean, seriously? That's from 2020. So the problem is, and Victoria put in the comments earlier, that the what's been missing from autism research is autistic people. And
I know the irony, right?
Uh-huh.
Missing from autism research is autistic people. I shouldn't laugh, but it's not.
All you can do is laugh, though. It's ridiculous, isn't it? And it's, you know, we're talking about double empathy, and seriously, they don't know why we're depressed. Look at what we've just been talking about for the past hour and a half. Look at what we always talk about when we get together. We always end up talking about invalidation and trauma and stigma and marginalization, but they don't know why.
That lack of empathy.
That lack of empathy
With the neurotypical people. Okay, so
they don't think to ask either. No, they don't think to ask autistic people either. That's the other, you know. We don't know what to do. Who should we ask?
The parents.
Yeah, the parents.
So, okay. So coming back then to the double empathy problem. So this is quite obviously quite clear, hopefully, but what does it tell us about autistic people, our need for sociality on our terms, and why our communication is different? Now, this kind of, because we've had to do the questions a little bit out of sync because Rachel needed to disappear. So to some extent, our communication is different, arguably somewhat to do with the hypothesis that Rachel has hypothesized. But certainly, yeah, I want us to have a discussion then about what does the double empathy tell us and about our need for sociality on our terms. Bobbi, you want to jump in?
Well, as late diagnosed or soon to be diagnosed in the middle of the process, for me, it was, I constantly talk about coming home, like the feeling of coming home when I came to the community, you know, the immediate acceptance, you know, the no questions of why is your hair like that, or why do you always wear black, or, you know what I mean? All these things that I was constantly getting in of this, you know, you're not conforming to the way we are, and why is that type thing? It wasn't there, you know, and I have the best conversations and the collaborations. I mean, you know, we did some great work with the whole Spectrum 10K stuff, you know. I mean, we've when we want to do something, we get it done. And the community is huge in reference to that. And finding the community is huge in reference to that. So what does the double empathy mean in our community? To me, it's non-existent. It doesn't exist in our community. Like, I don't have that problem. I don't feel like the need to constantly explain myself in any way.
And I think to add to that as well, when we do get confused with the person who isn't autistic as well in front of us, we just ask. We're so used to being misunderstood that and because we want, you know, we want to make sure we're being clear, or that, you know, if we're not sure, we will ask for somebody to clarify and things like that. Any other thoughts then on, so I think that was quite interesting what you're saying, Bobbi, because I guess the way I phrased it was, what does the double empathy problem tell us about our need for sociality and things like that? And I think that's quite interesting, because you're saying, well, we don't have it within the community, and you're quite right, that's not necessarily where I hadn't thought of it that way. But I guess what I'm asking is, what does it mean for us to know this, I guess, as well? So any other thoughts on sociality of autistic people and on our own terms?
Well, I guess a lot of the work that we've done with autistic people through the SYA program and kind of creating autistic spaces, and my PhD, really inspired by Damian Milton's participatory autism collective, and the idea that autistic people should be have meaningful kind of effect on research, and including autistic people and asking them questions about their experiences within those spaces, that we do have a different sociality. We do communicate differently, but we are much more accepting of difference within those space, within autistic space. We're much more willing to kind of, like you said, ask questions. And also communicate in other ways. You know, what we like to say is there's no, you know, participation is not just about speaking. You know, you can be in an autistic space, sitting in the corner, drawing in a pad, and be participating. You can be listening to other people and be participating, and making sure that that's validated, that you don't actually have to speak words to be a part of an autistic community. And I think that's really important. And I think, you know, there's been so much has been said, and I had so many things to say, but Kieran was talking earlier, and Rachel as well. Autistic people have, you know, sensory issues, and we don't have sensory issues. We experience the world sensorially based. It all comes back to sensorially. We experience our world different, and therefore everything about our experience becomes different. Which is amazing. And there's lots of amazing things about autistic people's experience of the sensorial world. And stimming is one of those things, which is so much a part of our culture. And there's obviously been people talking about within the autistic community for years, that stimming is a part of nonverbal communication. It's something that autistic people share. And whenever we have an autistic space, stimming is kind of one of the main things that brings autistic people together, and playing with objects and that experience, because it's not accepted within a neurotypical society. And I think that needs to be explored so much more, because basically kids in schools are still being told not to stim, to have quiet hands. And that is just such a horrible thing to do, because basically that is their coping mechanism.
And I'm going to come to Kieran, but I want to add, because I'm thinking of some of the groups that we've run and what Annette's sort of talking about here. And I have permission, because I'm actually using this as an example in a book chapter. So I got permission to use this anonymously. But we had this fantastic, I mean, I say this about every autistic person that I swear we ever have in our groups, because they're all so fantastic. We had this fantastic autistic person, and we noted, Annette and I, that they were putting very tiny objects on their head. And obviously, if that was a non-autistic space, and particularly if it was an autism researcher, so not an autistic researcher, they would be observing. They probably wouldn't ask what the person was doing or why. They would be talking about it in very negative terms. Whereas we were like, "Ooh, what are you doing? What?" And they were like, very quietly, because they've probably been invalidated so often for their natural autistic tendencies. But they were like, I just like putting things on my head and saying hat. And eventually those things, because we were like, oh, this is interesting. Why? What does it do? How does it feel? Oh, that's nice. And the objects over time got bigger and bigger until they were like a pillow. Like a few weeks later, they would just put a pillow on their head and go, hat. And it was beautiful. And it was we asked, we joined in with the excitement of it and understanding of it. And there was no pathologizing of something so innocent, and things like that. And I just think, what would have happened if that was a non-autistic person in that space? I mean, one, they probably wouldn't have done the behavior in the first place, maybe, but they were so used to us being us that I think they felt comfortable and safe to be able to start, which was fantastic. But yeah, that lack of empathy, where we were like, oh yes, tell us about it. What does that mean? And I think empathy does become very interesting in our community, because we get told by non-autistic people, when somebody's describing a situation that they've experienced and they're talking about it emotionally and all this kind of thing, and we go, oh, can I connect with that to show that I understand? And we bring up something that we feel is similar. If we're in a non-autistic space, they'll be like, it wasn't about you. Why have you made it about you? Whereas what we've actually done is we know we literally cannot experience and feel what that other person has felt. So what we do is the next best thing is demonstrate our empathy by saying, I think I can feel close to what you are describing because I experienced that. Continue telling me now that I've demonstrated my empathy and that I'm with you on this. And I think many of us apologize at the start, but I think we all get used to it, that actually that's okay, that we're demonstrating we get it, we're trying to connect with you. Sorry, Kieran, because I might have derailed your point.
No, you haven't at all. Actually, you've led really nicely into it. And because I was going to bring up community connectedness and the importance of that, and what you've described in terms of autistic people coming together and maybe initially feeling anxious and concerned because of your your past experience of being invalidated and gaslighted and traumatized, and but over time that dissipates, and over time you become more authentic in those spaces, and that shows the importance of that community connectedness and of being around other autistic people. And it's not just around being all autistic people, because of course there will always be autistic people you don't get on with and that you won't like, and but finding your neurokin, but also then finding people within that that validate you and accept you and make you feel good about yourself, as well as you feeling helping them feel good about themselves as well. That's part of that growth. And it's so distressing to me that we are isolated from that and kept apart from that for so long, and the autistic children now, even those that are identified, are being kept apart from themselves or only put together in very prescribed situations in school and education settings and things, and not allowed to explore being around people like them and learning from people like them, and experiencing that exchange of emotion, which is such a positive thing, and that positive exchange of autistic energy, which absolutely exists. And if you could see it, it would be a tangible thing connecting people, but it's snipped, it's constantly snipped, or barriers are put up in the way of that. And it's, I think one of the important things that autistic people coming into research is starting to do is that it is making people sit up slowly, but it is happening. It's making people sit up and realizing that we need to broaden our understanding of human experience, and that human experience isn't this very narrow kind of rigid, this is what humans do. Because that's really hubristic, because that's the whole concept of neurodiversity, that based on biodiversity, that there are, pick any creature off the planet or any plant off the planet, and there's huge variations in those things. They're all part of the same species, but they're hugely varied. So why are humans exactly the same? Why are humans being forced to adhere and conform to the same set of thinking patterns and acting patterns and doing patterns and all of those kind of things? So I think we need in the community, we're starting to recognize that we have a multiversal kind of experience, for want of an MCU phrase, but that we do experience things separately and individually to ourselves, but also that we can communicate that and share that, and it becomes relatable experience, and we can experience each other's experiences through that sharing. But that's not what happens in neurotypical communities. It's very, very, to use your phrase, Chloe, it's full of islands. The neurotypical world is full of islands, isolated individual people who think they're all acting and doing things in the same way, when in actual fact they're not at all. And that's another thing that distresses me. It makes me feel sad for non-autistic people that they don't experience that connectedness like we can, or at least they don't let themselves experience that connectedness like we can. It's like that there are barriers it's like they've got deficits to a degree. It's like they've got barriers there that are stopping them from doing that and enabling them to be their authentic selves, when it's something we're striving really hard to do.
And I think, so a number of things as well, building on what you've just said. So Damian says, lovers used to warn parents against autistic children being around each other as they might copy inappropriate behaviours. And I'm just thinking,
Good.
You've never seen the joy of sharing a weird stim that you've never done before with another human autistic person. It's lovely to find a new, that's why we're always asking, what's your favourite stim? Because I want to find new ones. I want to find new things that help me feel good about myself and regulate and so on. And the thing that I talk about and write about all the time at the moment is that we are wholly isolated when we are people with autism spectrum disorder. You are a completely isolated individual, but we can be a culture and a people when we are autistic people. And that's one of the saddest things that Annette and I see is, so we did autistic orientation for the new first years at university, and I think it was about 60 students in total, but we had them split over 3 days, so obviously so it was not too overwhelming. They get to come on campus before the rest of the student body turn up, all sorts of lovely things, and you can really tell the number of them that have been isolated people with autism spectrum disorder. They've never been in a room, at least not knowingly, with so many autistic people. I mean, we're talking like 20 people, which is a lot when you're autistic, right? And you can tell they have never, and there would be some very quiet ones, which is fine, sitting on the outskirts of maybe some of the discussions, or if we were doing like STEM activities or something like that, because it's so alien to them. And how awful to be really, you know, hidden from your own culture and your own understanding of yourself. And that's, you know, not to say it's their parents' fault or anything like that. They won't know any different, but it's really sad. And you can certainly see how they might hopefully join the groups that we have, which a number of them do, and start to build that sense of their self in connection to other autistic people is so important. So I think, yeah, certainly that's coming back to what does the myth that we lack empathy and a number of other things that we're supposed to lack and so on do to us. It creates completely and wholly isolated individuals, which, as we've talked about, leads to incredibly poor mental well-being and so on. And yeah, they don't know anything if they've never seen the sharing of a beautiful new stim. Okay, so because the time is getting on, we'll try and finish for 9. Here we've heard some bits and pieces to do with this question, which is where do we see the double empathy problem going? So we've kind of talked about that a bit, particularly with Rachel before Rachel left, and how will it help the autistic community. So I've got here things like, how will it change neurotypical perceptions and behaviour towards us, for instance, and any practical suggestions. So let's start with that. Where do we see the double empathy problem going, and how will it help the autistic community? Would anyone like to jump in, or do we feel like we said it all? I mean, oh, okay. Was that Kieran and then Bobbi? Can I do Bobbi and then Kieran? Is that all right? Yeah, Bobbi.
I was just going to say, in reference to double empathy as well as Rachel's hypothesis, both of them are incredibly exciting to me. There is nothing in schools right now in reference to social skill training of neurotypical kids. Social skill training in terms of the double empathy problem. And Rachel's hypothesis, right? So like, I'm now excited at this idea that possibly, you know, social skills training and the whole social stories and all of that stuff needs to be turned completely on its head, like literally on its head. And we need to have both, you know, autistic kids together. Yeah, all the autistic kids in the school together have their own little social group so that they can learn from each other, they can stim together, they can grow in the confidence and autonomy. And then the NTs also have their own little group where, guess what, they're learning about us. And instead of us having to fit in, because, you know, I look back on when you know better, you do better. But I look back on what I was doing in schools at one point 10, 15 years ago. And you know, the masking that was being enforced that I was a part of. And it breaks my heart now. But like I said, when you know better, you do better. And thankfully, I know better. So my heart automatically goes to the people that are working with the kids, and the therapists that are all, you know, social skill training, social skill therapy, you know, this idea that instead of, you know, how Lovis said, don't have them, the autistic kids around each other because they can mimic. Well, we were always told the opposite. Have as many neurotypical kids around the autistic child so that they can copy and they can learn from them and they can fit in a little bit more. Well, that's automatic masking, as Kieran, you know, highly talks about, and it's ingrained and you're causing constantly more trauma as it goes on. So what excites me is this idea of turning it all on its head for the kids in the schools, and especially in primary, you know, and getting that autonomy in them young. And the ability to self-advocate young, you know, that's kind of where I'm at. And I'm excited. Like, I'm not lying. I saw Rachel's and your live twice because it was just so exciting to me, because it changes everything. And it really goes on further from the whole idea of the double empathy, you know, and brings it home that little bit more. So, you know, I want to see more research into that. I want to see so much more research into that, because like, I even wrote notes. Like, I'm not kidding. I'm so buzzed. You know, the idea of the implication of those children that are non-mouth users, word users. You know, I don't like using nonverbal, and I always struggle around the terminology to use. But those people that don't use words. We are automatically in schools. These kids are seen as a deficit from day one. And if we switch that around, can you imagine how much we change their lives in that respect, and how much less trauma is being inflicted on the kids. And I could go on and on and on, and I won't, because I'll give you an example. Okay, years ago, there was a thing called Remaking Recess. Okay, it's from the States. And it's geared towards autistic kids at playtime. And the idea is that the lunchroom ladies, horrible word, saying the wrong word, but the lunchtime supervisors, okay, would be observing the autistic kids and then find out where they are in their interaction, whether they're a parallel play or a sole play, and then try to facilitate play with neurotypical kids. Like that was a thing at one point that was, implicated in the States, but also trying to bring it over here. And at one point, they even authorized me to sort of go ahead and do it in schools. When I looked into it deeper, from my point of view, I didn't do what they wanted. I'll be brutally honest, and I stopped because for me, I wanted the lunchroom ladies to understand the autistic child. And I wanted them to understand where the child was coming from and understand the autistic experience of that child. I didn't really, I saw, this idea of facilitated play as being just ableist. And I can't think of another word for it right now. Like I'm getting tired. But this whole thing, that's why I'm still buzzing about this whole thing and having Damian on and having Rachel on, because for me in schools, I see so much and everything can be switched over. Everything can be turned around. Everything can be just completely changed, and that medical model dissipates.
And yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you, Bobbi. It is I think Rachel's hypothesis is very exciting. And I think, yeah, and it did interest me when I asked Rachel to come back on and give us an update and things like that. And they were like, oh, are people interested? And I was like, Rachel, this is probably the most important video we've done so far. I mean, we've only been here since May last year, but we've been doing at least one video a week. And it's one of the most important ones we've done because it can really change people's perspective of us, instead of just going, well, it's just because they're autistic. Yeah, but what does that mean, right? We're now we're going to have this sort of evidence that it's because we have a different pragmatic language base, which is really, really helpful. And I think I have talked to Rachel quite a few months ago. So if anyone wants to take this on, because I have too many projects anyway, that Rachel, it'd be really, really important to build those, like those social stories books that we've moaned about before, but actually building a proper social stories book that will help translate for both autistic and neurotypical children, not in one direction, not trying to get autistic children to speak and understand and communicate like neurotypical children, but like a dictionary or not dictionary, a translator. Yeah.
How-to book. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but you just said in that short space of time everything that I was babbling on about. Like that's exactly what I'm talking about. Thank you very much.
That's okay. I'd like to clarify. I'd like to bring everything, to wrap it up, to bring everything together again. Kieran.
Hello. I don't think there's a real quick fix here. I think that's what so many people were desperate for, and so many people, parents, Bobbi, myself, people who have children within the school system, adults who are struggling with employment, with life generally, and things like that. We need a quick fix, and there isn't one. But what this is going to do, the way that I see this is you're going to get a kind of thing about how my head works now, that I see pistons and machines moving with multiple parts, and it's all interconnected, not just what we're talking about with double empathy, but social justice movements of all types all over the world, that we are working towards a shift, and we are pushing towards a shift, and the shifting kind of understanding of the broadening of human experience and what it means to be human, and to what impact we as humans have on the world around us and other creatures and other humans, and all of that is all interconnected. And I think the neurodiversity movement is so integral to that, because anybody could be autistic, anybody could be ADHD, anybody could be clinically depressed, anybody can get dementia. You know, all those things are interconnected. So anybody can become neurodivergent or be neurodivergent. It doesn't matter what your skin color is, what your race is, what your religion is, what country you come from, whatever. It can happen anywhere to anybody. And I think that's why we're at the heart of everything that's changing in the world right now. And there is huge resistance to that. And I think that's where the double empathy thing comes in so much, because of that resistance, because of where it is, because Bobbi's here to use the education system as an analogy. You know, I'm in so many education groups and groups for special educational needs, and horrible term, and that's so full of teachers, and I haven't got a clue. Absolutely have not got a clue what they're doing, and they're all there giving each other advice, reinforcing it, and it's exactly it speaks volumes to me that it's exactly the same as when I first started to explore being autistic and I was wandering into parent groups. They're all there, haven't got a clue, reinforcing each other, all these negative things, and that's not an indictment on them as professionals or as on parents or anything like that. It's because they haven't got the information that they need in order to be able to do their jobs properly. They've not been supported to be as good a parents as they can be, or as good a teachers as they can be, and the parents that are here will be recognizing this, that you need more. You need knowledge in order to be able to apply it. And in order to use that knowledge, you need to be able to recognize where that knowledge comes from. And when that knowledge comes from neurotypical people talking about us, it's worthless. Absolutely worthless. It's meaningless. It's has no substance whatsoever. It's superficial. When you dig down into it, there's just nothing underneath, because it's all observational. But when you start getting your source of knowledge from the source of knowledge, the real source of knowledge, who you're trying to apply this knowledge to, that knowledge needs to come from. It's a circular thing. It just keeps going round and round and round. You need inside knowledge. You need insight in order to be able to start making actual decisions based on information which is factual and true. So until that starts happening, we're not going to, you know, we're pushing for this drive for autonomy, but that information needs to be out there and it needs to be from the source. And until we get to that tipping point where the first port of call for anyone is, oh, look, autistic person in front of me. I know nothing about what it means to be autistic. Let's talk to autistic people. When that's the first thought that comes to heads, that's when we've got real change. And that's when we know that double empathy has worked. But until we get to that point, we need to keep applying it and applying it, applying it with all those pistons, with all those moving parts, doing it in our own different ways. Bobbi doing it in schools, Chloe, you doing it in the way that you do it, I do it in the way that I do it. And we come together and we come apart as we need to, as we've seen with Spectrum and other projects that we work together on and come apart from, you know. So until we get to that point where we can just get over that tipping point, I don't think anything really, really significant is going to change. But stuff like Rachel's work is going to push us ever, ever nearer to getting to that tipping point.
And Annette?
I'm just going to be quick because we're getting late. I just wanted to say, because I've been working in schools with kids for the last couple of years, autistic kids, and like you said, people are clueless, and the communication even between me and the teachers is sometimes difficult. But ultimately, it's stop trying to change autistic kids. Listen to autistic people and autistic kids. If you don't understand your child, you don't understand a child or an adult, talk to them, listen to them, and accept them for who they are. Stop trying to change autistic people. We don't need to be changed. We need to be understood. We need to be included. We need to be accepted as a culture and a community. And like you said, that's going to take time. And all we can do is the best we can, you know, person by person, you know, teaching other autistic people to be self-advocates for themselves. You know, we're building something right now. It's going to go into schools in London, which basically is teaching kids, you know, okay, what is my sensory profile? You know, a lot of the people that I spoke to when I was doing my PhD never had been asked, what is your experience of sound? What is your experience of smell? That never, their entire lives, no one had been interested in that experience. And that is what ultimately needs to change. And I hope, teaching autistic people to kind of look at that and then create words, create, their own profile, which basically talks about alexithymia, talks about, their emotional experience, talks about all those different aspects as well as sensory, can help autistic people and kids that can self-advocate for themselves, and then teach other kids to self-advocate for themselves. And hopefully we can just continue that on generation after generation. Ultimately, and obviously teaching within the schools to all the neurotypical people that need to understand our culture.
Scoop, scoop, scoop. Just always scooping. This is what we do. It's fantastic. It's very exciting. It is very exciting. The double empathy problem does show the problem. And while it demonstrates that the problem is in the middle, it's in the interaction, I think as autistic people, the onus has been on us for too long anyway. So when people say, but it's, communication is reciprocal. Yes, but when you're the more powerful majority, i.e. neurotypical, you're not having to work at it to understand us and learn and communicate in a way that actually we will understand as well, and in that exchange. I think we've tried and we've worked really, really hard. And like somebody said, I flagged it earlier on, and apologies, I don't remember who said it now because it's quite far up in the comments, but it was that, and I said the same thing. I'm actually incredibly good at perspective taking, particularly with neurotypical people, even though they confuse me still. I can still perspective take, even if I don't understand why are you doing that though. That's not logical. That doesn't make sense to me. But I understand that you've done it, etc., etc. So actually we can become very, very good at perspective taking. And I would always say that my challenge, I put it on when I do training, I'll do, these are my challenges and these are my strengths as an autistic person, to demonstrate we all have them. And on my challenges thing, it's actually not about me. It's about the challenges I have. And I say the biggest challenge I have is people misunderstanding me. But when I say that, I actually mean non-autistic people misunderstanding me, not perspective taking with me, not understanding my experience of the world, and things like that, where I don't necessarily have that issue with autistic people, because if you don't understand, you just ask me. It's just so much more straightforward. So I'm going to stay on this excited, because we could go down, it's depressing as well because the double empathy problem still exists. But actually, I think we can be excited as well about where this can be going to support us. Yes, we can have, I put here creation of reciprocal and equitable communication training. So stop saying about trying to teach us how to communicate like you. Where is that reciprocal communication training? So that not one-sided social skills training, for instance. Our social skills are amazing. We have amazing social skills. You just don't understand them. You just need to learn our social skills. Okay, fantastic. So I've got my final quote, and then we're going to do my favorite last question, unless anyone's got any key things they were really itching to get out. I think we've done a really good job today. Okay, so quoting from the same paper that I quoted at the start. So the way forward is not to seek a way of changing autistic people to make them fit in quotation marks, but to change society to make us all more tolerant of diversity. I'd like it to be embracing of diversity, but I guess at this stage we would be happy with tolerance. Would something, anything. Give us a little nugget. Sorry, derailing the quote. Doing so will not only improve the quality of life and the productivity of autistic people, although we could go in a whole different discussion about why do we need to be productive, but still, but will make society a better and more functional place for everyone. End quote. I'm obviously low on spoons as well because I messed up my sentence. So yeah, and I think yes, we with the double empathy problem can really start. Well, we're starting to go places, and I'm very, very appreciative of Damian's contribution to the autistic community, and very appreciative of Rachel, and very excited for Rachel, where they're going to be going with this as well. Thank you everyone for being here. We're going to ask our favourite last question, just to see if anyone's changed their minds, actually, because I will have asked the three people on the screen before. But what are everybody's favourite stims? Anyone got a different one from last time that they've been on? Bobbi, what's your favourite stim? Still spinny rings. I've seen the spinny rings. Yeah.
I'm just, it's constant. And you guys got me into these as well. Yeah. You guys got me into
Kieran's
that.
left out. Oh no, I feel bad now. We need to send Kieran empathy. I feel bad for Kieran because he doesn't have one. We need to send one to Kieran.
But you guys got me into this as well.
Oh yeah.
So, and there's something about, I'm constantly, even my youngest said to me today, he's like, you always have it at your face. I'm like, yeah, I know. There's something about just, it has to be here. Yeah.
This is just, and in an ode to that autistic person, hat. I don't know if they watch our stuff at the moment. They may do. Hat.
Yeah, I do that as well. I tend to cover my mouth.
Yeah.
I think part of it is just me feeling overwhelmed and not wanting my resting bitch face then is hidden.
It's not, it's resting autie face.
I know. But yeah, but it also feels nice. I love things against my lip.
And Kieran, favorite stim at the moment?
It's probably not one I've not talked about before, but actually it's the one that I do most of the time, and I can't do it at the moment, which is why it's in my head, which is Wookiee roaring. I roar like a Wookiee all the time, and I can't, because I've had a chest infection and a sore throat and stuff. I can't do it.
Oh no!
And I kind of get started, and then my voice cracks, and I can't speak for 10 minutes. So it's I'm not going to demonstrate it, but no, I miss really missing it, and I never really talk about. I've talked about it a few times, but I never really talk about it. I think because I do it all the time, and I do it in my head as well as out loud. It's just normalized for me, so I don't think of it as a stim because I'm just doing it constantly.
And that's another thing that is really huge about stimming is so many people have masked their stimming for so long. They don't think they stim, but they do. They just don't realize what they're doing as a stim. And it takes ages to almost reteach ourselves. Okay, that's stimming and that's a good thing and it's okay. And I should do it more because it's good for our well-being.
So many things as well. People are jumping in the chat box as well, letting us know what they like. And Damian, so Damian likes pacing and rocking. And if you've ever seen Damian deliver his talks, he does tend to demonstrate something whilst bouncing a table tennis ball on a table tennis bat to demonstrate actually about our hyperfocus and things like this. But I do know that Damian loves table tennis. Which is his favourite stimmy activity, and just because people were talking about the octopus, so I very much like words as well. So saying words that are quite stimmy. So one of my favourite words is sausages. I also like the word pygmy. Pygmy to write as well is a beautiful word. The lots of so P because it's got the long tail. Y's got a tail.
Flows, isn't it?
It's lovely, like the number of tails. It's fantastic. But the plural of octopus is octopodes, and I love it. It's such a stimmy word, octopodes as well. So somebody was saying in the comment section about they're loving the octopus, but they're octopodes when you've got multiple. It's lovely. Right, what have we got next week? We have got next week, because we had to shift things around, we have got Emma Reardon next week. So get back to a very serious topic again, I'm afraid, but it's a very important one. Sorry, I've just seen Si's. So
timing.
Banners. So we'll come back to that in a second. Okay. I don't know, Si. Who could have possibly deleted the evil mayonnaise banner? Anyway, so next week we have Emma Reardon, and we're going to be discussing sensory trauma. So the importance of understanding that actually we can experience in our bodies, and for a long term sort of complex or PTSD. So trauma from sensory issues. Yes, I may have deleted some of the banners because there was quite a number of them. And yes, I still wants to carry on this feud between me, the salad cream team, and the mayonnaise team, which is him. But I'm aware that, isn't it Miracle Whip for Bobbi?
Miracle Whip is the UK salad cream, so I'm total team salad cream. I'm total team salad cream.
And I can't remember where do you fall on this?
Ketchup.
Raw ketchup. And Annette is just like,
I'm Miracle Whip. I'm a
Miracle
American.
Whip. There you go. Although somebody says Miracle Whip is death. So everyone's doing all the bits in the comment section.
Although
Maybe that's
I wouldn't like it now. I don't think it's probably got too much sugar in it. I don't know.
Oh, it's horribly filled with
Yeah, it
sugar.
is.
I had it recently when I was over in the States, and I was like, wait a minute, why did it start tasting like this? It was bizarre. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And we're all banned. And Damien, so Damien's jumping in as well. So he can't do either salad cream or mayonnaise.
Team ketchup.
Ketchup. Team ketchup. Okay.
You can put ketchup on anything.
No, you can put
Yes,
salad
you
cream
can.
on anything.
No, you can't.
You can't put ketchup on a salad. That's weird.
Why is it weird? It's got tomatoes in it.
No, that's gross. Anyway, okay. And then Ellie, I love it. Ellie's like, because when we had Dr. Nick Walker on, she's all for hummus. So Ellie's going to fight die fighting on the hill of Team Hummus. And then Luca.
You'd sink into Hummus Hill, wouldn't you?
Oh,
And then Luca, no ketchup on pasta, they shout in Italian. Okay. Feel free, you three, to just stay on just to say thanks everything once I hang up on everybody like it's a telephone from the 90s. I don't know. That I've really gone off on a weird tangent now. Have you not seen some of the videos where they ask more, you know, the young people, how would you demonstrate, you know, using a telephone or, you know, using a phone? And they do this, like they're holding a mobile. Obviously, we will do this because this is a telephone from like the 90s. And Sai's joking in the comments that infamy, you've all got it in for me. We've really just gone on a random tangent. So if you're still here, you've just got inertia. So you're stuck with us. But we're going to disappear now. Thank you everyone so much for being here. Feel free to listen to our jingle. I've got to love our outro. Bye everyone.
Bye.